The story I'm sharing today begins in a small, drafty apartment where the silence of my husband's absence is the only thing that fills the rooms. My name is Hannah Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and for a long time, I was the embarrassing branch off the family tree because I was a widow who couldn't keep her head above water. I'm writing this now as a record for my daughter, Sophie. A note to our future selves so we never forget the day my own mother decided our grief was a social liability she could no longer afford to be associated with. Have you ever given every ounce of your strength to survive a tragedy, only to have the people who should love you most treat you like a failure for struggling, while my mother, Gloria, was busy maintaining her perfect social standing and hosting pristine garden parties? I was drowning in the aftermath of my husband Thomas's cancer battle. I stayed behind, selling everything we owned and working double shifts just to keep a roof over Sophie's head while the medical bills piled up like a mountain. It wasn't pretty. I came home with eyes red from crying and hands shaking from exhaustion, but I made sure my daughter never went to bed hungry. To my mother, though, my scuffed shoes and tired face meant only one thing: shame. I still remember the look on her face at a family gathering a year ago when an old friend asked how I was doing. She didn't talk about my strength. She actually lowered her voice, looked away, and said, "Hannah is just going through a bit of a mess phase. She's not quite ready for company yet." She couldn't even say the word poverty. When I tried to tell her later that we were struggling for basic necessities, she pulled me into the kitchen and hissed, "Why can't you just be more like your cousins? This struggling widow routine is becoming an embarrassment to this family." I swallowed it. I swallowed the hurt, the fury, and the way my own relatives looked through me like I was a ghost. I told myself that if I just worked harder, if I just survived one more month, she'd finally see the heart I was putting into raising Thomas's daughter. I had no idea that a single afternoon tea was coming, and with it, a comment so cruel it would finally break me and change everything. Before I tell you exactly what my mother said to me and Sophie that day, and the incredible way our lives transformed after we walked away, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and what city are you watching from? I'm truly curious to see how far this story of resilience will travel. The air in my mother's sunroom always smelled of expensive peonies and judgment. It was a space designed for light, but as I sat on the edge of a velvet chair that likely cost more than me entire year's rent, I felt nothing but a heavy, suffocating shadow. The dull ache in my calves from the long walk between the bus stop and the estate gates was a steady, throbbing reminder of the world I now inhabited, a world my mother refused to acknowledge. Beside me, 7-year-old Sophie sat perfectly still, her small hand gripping mine. I dressed her in the best she had, a faded blue dress I meticulously ironed until the steam scorched my fingers. But next to my mother's friends and their grandchildren in designer silk, we looked like charcoal sketches in a room full of oil paintings. My mother, Gloria, was in her element. She moved between her guests with a silver tea service, her laughter sounding like wind chimes, light, hollow, and perfectly tuned. I watched her eyes skim over me, avoiding my face, resting instead on the frayed hem of my sleeve, and the way I tried to tuck my feet back to hide the worn soles of my only pair of shoes. I had spent the morning wondering if today would be the day she finally asked how we were really doing, if she'd ask if the cupboards were bare, or if Sophie was still waking up crying for her father. "It's so brave of you to come out, Hannah," one of her friends, a woman draped in pearls, said with a pitying tilt of her head. "I don't think I could even find the energy to take the bus if it were in your situation." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her that I didn't have the luxury of choice, that the bus was my only link to the two jobs keeping us alive. But my mother interrupted before I could utter a syllable. "Hannah is just having a difficult time adjusting to her new reality," Gloria said, her voice smooth as glass. She didn't look at me. She looked at her guests as if she were apologizing for a stain on the rug. "She's always been a bit sensitive. It's a shame, really. She used to have such potential before all off thighs." Room went quiet for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that feels like a slap. I felt Sophie's grip tighten. My daughter might have been young, but she wasn't blind. She could feel the shame radiating off her grandmother like heat. "Mom, please," I whispered, my voice thick. "We came because you said you wanted to see Sophie. We didn't come to be discussed like a charity case." Gloria finally turned to me, and the mask of the perfectistess slipped. Her eyes were hard, reflecting nothing but the social cost of my presence. Look at the two of you, Hannah. You're thin, you're disheveled, and you're bringing that gloom into my home. I have a reputation to uphold in this town, and frankly, having the two of you here looking like this, it's an embarrassment. Embarrassment. The word hung in the air, sharp and final. It was the sound of a bridge snapping. I looked at my mother, the woman who had watched me bury my husband and offered nothing but critiquescen my mourning attire, and I realized the person I was looking for was gone. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, my spine straighter than it had been in years. I looked at Sophie, whose eyes were wide and brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "Come on, Sophie," I said softly. "We're in the wrong place." As we walked toward the door, leaving the silver tea sets and the silent judgment behind, I could hear my mother's voice rising, apologizing to her guests for the scene. I didn't look back. We stepped out of the mansion and began the long walk back toward the road, the distance between us and that life growing with every step. I had no way of knowing that this walk was the first mile of a journey that would take us across the world. But first, we had to survive the night. The rain didn't just fall. It felt as though the sky had finally given up, matching the heavy, rhythmic thrum of my heart. As we reached the iron gates of my mother's estate, the first fat drops began to soak through Sophie's faded cotton dress. We didn't have an umbrella, and we didn't have a car waiting for us. To save the last few dollars in my bank account for Sophie's school lunch, we had taken the bus, a detail my mother had looked at with such disdain I thought she might faint. We walked in silence for the first 2 blocks, the water blurring the world around us. Sophie's small hand was a warm, trembling weight in mine. I waited for her to cry. Waited for her to ask why her grandmother didn't want us there, but she remained eerily still. Her silence was louder than any scream. Under the rusted awning of a closed-down corner store, Iffinly stopped. I knelt in the wet concrete, ignoring the chill seeping into my knees, and took her face in my hands. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, and her eyes, Thomas's eyes, were wide and searching. "Sophie," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What Grandma said, it wasn't true. You're the best thing that ever happened to Tothai's world. Do you hear me?" She looked at me for a long beat, a raindrop trailing down her cheek like a tear. "I know, Mommy," she said, her voice small but impossibly steady. "She's just lonely in that big house, but we have each other. That's better, right?" A sob caught in my throat, but I forced it down. In that moment, the hierarchy of my life shifted. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I wasn't a victim of my circumstances. I was a fortress. "It's better than anything," I promised. "From now on, it's just us. We are our own family. We are enough." We stood there and shook on it. A secret pact made in the rain, sealed with a hug that felt like the only warm thing left in the world. As we started toward the bus stop, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, the screen glowing against the gray afternoon. A message from Gloria. "Your behavior today was the height of immaturity. If you want to be treated like an adult, you need to start acting like one. Don't bother calling," ready to apologize for that scene. I looked at the words, and for the first time in years, they didn't hurt. They felt like a foreign language I no longer spoke. I didn't type a reply. I didn't even hesitate. I tapped her. Contact, hit block, and watched her name disappear into the digital void. We stepped onto the bus, dripping wet and shivering, heading back to an apartment with an empty fridge and a pile of final notice letters. I had no idea how I was going to feed her tomorrow, or where the strength would come from to keep going. I only knew that the door behind us was locked forever. What I didn't know was that while I was blocking my past, someone else was already searching for my future. The apartment was so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator felt like a roar, which was ironic considering how little there was inside to keep cold. I stood in the kitchen, the linoleum peeling under my feet, staring at the lone box of generic pastond, a single bruised apple. This was the bottom. Not just the bottom of the cupboard, but the bottom of a life I never thought I'd lead. I prepared the meal with the precision of a chef, making sure the portion in Sophie's bowl looked as full as possible. When she sat down at the small, wobbly table, she looked at my empty space, her brow furrowing in that way that made her look exactly like her father. "Aren't you eating, Mommy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I had a big lunch at the office, sweetie," I lied, the words tasting like ash. My stomach cramped in protest, a sharp, gnawing reminder that my last meal had been a sleeve off saltines nearly 24 hours ago. I watched her eat, her small movements so careful, as if she were trying to make the food last forever. Thomas was everywhere in this room, but mostly he was in a thick stack of envelopes sitting on the counter. They were final notices, printed in aggressive red ink that seemed to bleed through the paper. The hospital, the oncology clinic, the ambulance service, they didn't care that the man they had treated was gone. They only cared about the numbers. Every time I looked at those bills, I felt like I was drowning in the very medicine that had failed to save him. The debt was a ghost that haunted us more than his absence did. It was a weight that my mother, Gloria, could have lifted with the stroke of a pen, a mere fraction of what she spent on her sunroom furniture. But I had blocked her number, and with it, I had buried the hope of any rescue that required me to surrender my self-respect. That night, after Sophie fell into a restless sleep, I sat at the small desk Thomas had built for me. I pulled out my old laptop, the screen flickering with a dying, stuttering light. My finger hovered over the keys. I didn't have money, and I didn't have a family left, but I had a story. I had words that felt like fire in me chest, words about what it meant to love someone through end, and then be branded an embarrassment by the living. I began to type, the clicking of the keys the only sound in the hollow apartment. I wasn't writing for a paycheck or for fame. I was writing because if I didn't get the truth out, I thought it might shatter. I hit publish on a small, global forum for cancer families, sharing my heart with strangers because my own blood had turned its back. I closed the lid, never imagining that my desperate, late-night confession was currently being flagged by a digital team in a glass building thousands of miles away. The sun was barely peeking through the cracked blinds of our apartment when the world began to vibrate. It wasn't the usual rattling of the radiator or the thunder of the morning bus. It was my phone. It buzzed incessantly against the wood of the kitchen table, a frantic rhythm of notifications that made my heart leap into my throat. My first thought was a surge of panic. Had the debt collectors found a new way to reach me? Had my mother bypassed the block? I reached for the device with trembling fingers. My screen was a blur of activity. The post I had written in the dark, fueled by hunger and heartbreak, had been shared 10,000 times, then 50,000. Benny asked me words about Thomas Scourge and the cold sting of being called an embarrassment. There were thousands of comments from people in London, Tokyo, and New York. They weren't judging my scuffed shoes, they were seeing my soul. Amidst the sea of notifications, one email stood out. The subject line was simple, a message from Hope Beyond Cancer International. I stared at the name. I knew who they were. They were the gold standard of advocacy, a global force that provided a voice for the voiceless in the cancer community. My breath hitched as I clicked it open. The letter wasn't a form response or a generic offer of pity. It was signed by the CEO herself. Dear Hannah, it read. We didn't just read your story, we felt it. For too long, the families left behind in the wake of this disease have been expected to suffer in silence or worse, in shame. Your words have started a conversation that our organization has been trying to ignite for years. You have a rare gift, the ability to turn raw pain into a bridge for others. We don't just want to help you, Hannah. We want to invite you to help us change the world. The letter detailed an immediate offer of relocation, the settlement of Thomas's medical debts, and a proposal for a role I couldn't even fathom, International Ambassador for Care. They wanted me to speak for the families who were hiding in the shadows, just as I had been. I looked over at Sophie, who was stirring in her sleep, her small face pale against the pillow. For months, I had been looking at her final notice letters as the end of our lives. I looked back at the screen, at the blue and white logo of the NGO that looked like a rising sun. This wasn't just a lifeline, it was a total reclamation. The embarrassment Gloria had tried to bury was the very thing Thai's organization wanted to celebrate. My hand went to my myth as the first tear of relief finally broke. I picked up my phone to reply, but a shadow crossed the window. A sleek, black car, one that looked very much like the Inez parked at my mother's estate, had just pulled up to the curb of our crumbling building. The hum of the jet engine was a low, steady vibration that felt like the pulse of a new life. I sat in the cabin, my fingers tracing the smooth leather of the armrest, staring out the window at a world made of clouds. Beside me, Sophie was fast asleep, her head resting on a plush pillow, her face finally free of the tension that had lived there since her father died. Only a week ago, we had been calculating the cost of a bus ticket. Now, the sky was our only boundary. In my lap lay a folder embossed with the silver seal of Hope Beyond Cancer International. Inside was the speech I was supposed to deliver in Geneva. My hands shook as I turned the pages. For years, I had been told to speak softly, to hide misstruggle, and to keep the ugliness of our poverty away from polite ears. Now I was being asked to do the exact opposite. When we landed, the transition was a blur of flashing lights and soaring glass ceilings. I stood backstage at the conference hall, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd. Through a crack in the heavy velvet curtains, I saw rows of delegates, scientists, and world leaders. My heart hammered against my ribs, a familiar panic. What was I doing here? I was just Awado from a drafty apartment. I was the embarrassment. They aren't here for a polished performance, Hannah, the CEO whispered, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. They are here for the truth. Just tell them about Thomas. Tell them about the walk in the rain. I stepped into the light, the silence that met me was deafening. I looked down at the microphone, then out at Thesia of faces. I didn't look at the teleprompter. Instead, I thought of the empty cupboards and the red ink on the hospital bills. I thought of the way my mother had looked through me as if I were a ghost. My name is Hannah Bennett, I began, my voice small but clear. And for a long time, I was told that my grief and my struggle were things to be ashamed of. As I spoke, something miraculous happened. The air in the room changed. I saw a woman in the front row, a dignitary in a sharp suit, wipe away a tear. I saw men lean forward, their faces softening. I told them that poverty after loss isn't a failure of character, but a failure of support. I told them that dignity isn't found in a silver tea service, but in the courage to keep standing when the world wants you to disappear. When I finished, there was a beat of absolute stillness. Then the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a standing ovation that felt like it could shake the foundations off the building. In that moment, the last of Gloria's poison left my system. Mystery wasn't a stain. It was a beacon. I realized then that my voice wasn't just a way to survive. It was a weapon, and I wasn't just beginning to learn how to use it. The flash of a camera lens was the only thing that felt familiar anymore, but even that had changed. 2 years ago, I had been a woman people looked through. Now, I was the woman the world looked to. I stood in the lobby of a high-rise in Singapore, adjusting the lapel of a tailored blazer that fit like armor. My reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows didn't show a ghost or an embarrassment. It showed a woman whose voice had raised millions for families like hers, a woman who had turned her husband's legacy into a global shield. Life now was a symphony of light and purpose. We lived in a home where the sun didn't just leak through cracks in theblines. It flooded every room, warming the oak floors and the photos of Thomas that finally had a place of honor. There were no final notice envelopes on the counter. Instead, there were invitations to summits, thank you notes from widows in villages I'd visited, and Sophie's school reports. Sophie. That was the greatest victory. I watched her through the window of our new garden later that afternoon, her laughter ringing out as she studied for a biology exam. She was thriving at an international school where her maturity was seen as a strength, not a scar. She no longer checked the fridge to see if there was enough. She no longer looked at me with the fearful eyes of a child waiting for the sky to fall. She was safe, she was whole. But even in the brilliance of this new life, the past has a way of catching up. My phone, sitting on the marble island, lit up with a notification that made my breath hitch. It wasn't an email from the NGO or a message from a colleague. It was a Google alert for a name I hadn't spoken in 24 months, Gloria Reynolds. I clicked the link, expecting to see a photo of another socialite garden party or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Instead, I saw a headline from my hometown's local paper that made the air in. Room feels suddenly thin. Historic Reynolds estate slate for foreclosure amidst legal battles. Below the text was agony photo of my mother. She wasn't holding a silver tea service. She was standing on her porch, looking frail and hollowed out, shielding her face from a process server. The woman who had cast us out for being a stain on her reputation was now the front-page scandal of the town. For 2 years, I had lived in a world where she didn't exist, building a mountain she could never climb. I thought I was done with her, but as I stared at her defeated expression, I noticed something else. A series of missed calls from an unknown number with a familiar area code. The predator was now the prey, and for the first time, I realized that my success hadn't just saved me, it had put a target on my back. They say that living well is the best revenge, but I never wanted revenge. I just wanted peace. However, the universe has a way of balancing the scales that is both poetic and brutal. While I was building a life defined by generosity and global impact, the foundation of my mother's world was quietly rotting away. I would later learn that the silence in the Reynolds estate had become deafening. The friends who had once sipped tea and judged my scuffed shoes had vanished the moment the Rumorsoff bankruptcy began to circulate. The reputation Gloria had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was dissolving like sugar in hot water. Mismanaged investments and a desperate need to maintain appearances had drained her accounts dry. She was alone in a museum of her own making, surrounded by gold velvet and unpaid staff. But the true crack in the porcelain didn't happen when Thebank notices arrived. It happened on a Tuesday evening, in the glow of the television she kept on to fill the empty rooms with noise. I was in London, sitting for a primetime interview regarding a new initiative for cancer support. I was wearing a suit that commanded respect, my hair polished, my voice steady as I spoke to millions about the power of resilience. I wasn't the widow charity case anymore. I was a force. Back in Ohio, Gloria looked up from a stack of overdue bills and saw the screen. She didn't see a stranger. She saw the eyes of the child she had discarded. She saw the embarrassment sitting under studio lights, the chyron beneath my name reading, Hannah Bennett, International Ambassador for Care. She watched the host lean in with admiration, watched the B-roll footage off me cutting ribbons on new centers and hugging survivors who looked at me like I was a lifeline. For the first time, Gloria didn't see me as a failure. She saw him as an asset. The realization must have hit her with the force of a physical blow. The daughter she had been too ashamed to claim was no walking in circles Gloria could only dream of entering. But she didn't feel remorse. As she stared at my image, realizing I had access, influence, and most importantly, money, the gears off her survival instinct began to turn. She didn't miss me. She missed the security I now represented. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling not with grief, but with calculation. She dialed the number she had once sneered at, desperate to hear my voice. But the call didn't go through. It clicked and went straight to a dead silence. She stared at the screen, confused, until the reality sank in. The digital wall I had built that rainy afternoon, the block I had placed on her number to save my own sanity, was still standing, impenetrable. She lowered the phone, her eyes narrowing at the television screen. She couldn't call me. But Gloria was a woman who viewed boundaries as mere suggestions. As she watched Mesmal on screen, she realized that if she couldn't reach me by phone, she would have to find a way to crash the party in person. Safety is a fragile illusion, constructed of locked doors, blocked numbers, and ocean-wide distances. I had spent 2 years building a fortress around Sophie and myself, believing that my success was the ultimate barricade. But I forgot that desperation has a way of picking even the most sophisticated locks. I was at a fundraising gala in New York, standing beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't sipped. The room was filled with donors and dignitaries, a hum of polite conversation that usually put me at ease. I was speaking to a potential partner about a newsdealership fund when I felt a hand on my forearm. The touch wasn't tentative, it was possessive. A grip I hadn't felt since I was a child being steered away from unsuitable people. "There she is," a voice cooed, a sound that turned my blood toice. "My superstar." I turned slowly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against me ribs. Standing there, clutching a beaded clutch that I recognized from a decade ago, was Gloria. She looked like a fatting photocopy of the woman who had banished me. Her hair was still coiffed, but the dye job washarsh. Her dress was elegant, but slightly dated, pulling tight across her shoulders. But it was her eyes that terrified me. They weren't cold anymore. They were glistening with a terrifying, theatrical warmth. "Mom," the word escaped me before I could stop it, stripping away the ambassador title and reducing me instantly to the daughter in the rain. "Oh, don't look so shocked, darling," she said, leaning in to kiss me cheek. She smelled of stale perfume and anxiety. She pulled back, keeping her hands on my shoulders, performing fourth room. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself. It was telling everyone at the club, that's my Hannah. She gets her resilience from me." Gently but firmly removed her hands from my arms. I saw the flash of irritation in her eyes, quickly masked by a smile. "What are you doing here, Gloria?" I asked, my voice low. How did you even get? Mother doesn't need an invitation to see her daughter's triumph, she breezed, though her gaze darted nervously toward the security guards near the exit. She leaned in closer, the facade dropping just enough for me to see the panic beneath. We need to talk, Hannah, privately. It's about the estate. I steered her toward a quiet alcove, away from the donors. The moment we were out of earshot, the proud mother activaporated. Her posture slumped and the predator emerged. They're going to take the house, she hissed, the sweetness replaced by a sharp, demanding edge. The bank gave me 30 days. I need 50,000 by Friday to stop the proceedings. And since you're clearly doing so well, wearing silk while your mother is being thrown onto the street, I expect you toe-handle it. She didn't ask. She didn't apologize for the years of silence or the embarrassment comment. She simply held out her hand, expecting me to fill it because she believed she owned my success. She looked at me not as a person she had hurt, but a bank account she had finally unlocked. It is your duty, she pressed, her voice rising with entitlement. I raised you. I made you who you are. You owe me this. I stared at her, realizing that she truly believed that my resilience was her creation, rather than the armor I built to survive her. She was waiting for me to crumble, to write that check to buy her love one last time. But she had forgotten one thing. I wasn't the girl who sat silently in the sunroom anymore. They say the hardest thing about moving on isn't letting go off people who hurt you. It's letting go of the version of yourself that still wants their love. For a fleeting second, looking at my mother's desperate face in that quiet alcove, I felt the old pull to be the good daughter and fix everything. But then I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were the hands of a woman who had carried a child through the dark, built a global legacy from the ashes of a broken heart, and no longer needed permission to exist. Gloria stood there, her hands still outstretched as if the world owed her a tribute. Her fingers were bare, the skin pale where her signature rings had clearly been pried off to pay for her flight or more weeks off electricity. Well, she prompted, her voice sharpening with that familiar, stinging impatience. I assume you have your checkbook in that designer bag. Let's get this over with so I can go back and handle the lawyers. I didn't reach for my bag. I didn't even blink. I just really looked at her, and saw the smallness of the woman who had once loomed like a giant in my life. Remember that tea party, Mom? I said, my voice so calm it seemed to startle her. I remember sitting in your sunroom, listening to you tell your friends that Sophie and I were in embarrassment. I remember walking to the bus stop in the rain because we weren't worth a ride in your car. Gloria waved a hand dismissively, her empty fingers clutching her worn beaded bag. Oh, for heaven's sake, Hannah, that was years ago. I was stressed. I was trying to protect our family's image. Surely you've grown up enough to understand that. Have grown up, I replied. I took a step closer, watching the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I've grown enough to realize that you were right about one thing. You told me that people like us, struggling, grieving, disheveled people, didn't belong in your high society circles. You said we were a stain on your reputation. I paused, a cold, clear peace settling over me. Now I'm Theana in these circles, Mom, and looking at you now trying to oust me for a status you destroyed yourself, I realize you were right. Embarrassments really don't belong here. Color drained from her face, leaving her looking every bit off her age. You wouldn't, she stammered. I'm your mother. You were a mother until the moment it became inconvenient for your image, I said. I've already settled Thomas's debts. I've secured Sophie's future. But I will not fund your vanity. I forgave you a long time ago, Gloria, but forgiveness doesn't mean I have to let you back in. My life is full of light now, and there's no room left for your shadow. I turned my back on her before she could utter another word. I walked out of that alcove and back into the gala, the sound of her calling my name fading into the background noise of a world she no longer commanded. I found Sophie standing by a window, looking out at the New York skyline, her reflection bright and bold against the glass. I took her hand and we walked out together. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. We were finally truly home.